Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. In the winter of 1942, while bombs rained down on British cities, an economist was drafting a revolution, not with weapons but with words. Sir William Beveridge saw war as more than destruction. He saw it as an opportunity. Old institutions were crumbling, social hierarchies were shifting, and Britain stood on the precipice of something new. In Social Insurance and Allied Services, better known as the Beveridge Report, he argued that this was no time for patchwork reforms, it was a moment for transformation. A bold manifesto emerged, calling for the eradication of 5 great evils: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. Beveridge envisioned a Britain where no citizen would suffer the indignities of extreme poverty, unemployment, or inadequate healthcare. His solution was radical: a universal contributory welfare system, ensuring a minimum standard of living for all. The Beveridge Report did not merely propose policy, it imagined a different society. The idea of a welfare state was not entirely new, but Beveridge gave it shape, structure, and urgency. Britain had suffered economic stagnation in the interwar years, leaving millions in cyclical poverty. Records from the National Archives reveal harrowing accounts of deprivation, particularly in the Pilgrim Trust Inquiry of 1936. Families of 5 crowded into single damp rooms, surviving on stale bread and tea, with no hope of stable employment. Chronic malnutrition and psychological despair were commonplace. Unemployment benefits existed, but were inadequate and inconsistent. Those who slipped through the cracks of social insurance had little recourse beyond charity or workhouses, relics of a harsher Victorian past. Beveridge rejected this status quo. He argued that economic security should be a right, not a privilege, and that the state had a duty to protect its citizens from falling into destitution. Inside Westminster, however, his sweeping vision was met with caution, even hostility. The Treasury balked at the cost, fearing financial collapse. Churchill, though politically shrewd, was reluctant to commit, wary of promising a post-war golden age before the war had been won. His Chancellor, Kingsley Wood, dismissed Beveridge's plan as utopian and economically reckless. He questioned whether employers would accept compulsory contributions for the unemployed, whether doctors would agree to become state employees, and whether universal, non-means-tested benefits were truly sustainable. Wood's scepticism was blunt. Would the millionaire walking to the post office for his state pension not be an absurdity? Even Lord Cherwell, Churchill's close advisor, raised concerns about how Britain's financial lifeline, the United States, would react. America was funding Britain's war effort, yet here was a proposal to introduce a welfare system more generous than anything the United States itself had. Could Britain afford to appear as if it were redistributing wartime aid towards social security? As debates raged in government, the public had already decided. The response to the Beveridge Report was electric. Opinion polls showed an overwhelming majority in favour of its recommendations, particularly the promise of a universal health service. The British Institute for Public Opinion found that 95% of the population had heard of the report, and most believed its proposals should be implemented. Yet there was a paradox. While people supported Beveridge's plan, many doubted it would ever happen. Scepticism ran deep. Big business, entrenched interests, and financial realities seemed too formidable. The Ministry of Information's Home Intelligence reports from December 1942 show letters flooding government offices, reflecting both enthusiasm and fear. "This plan will give the boys who are fighting something to look forward to," wrote one citizen. Another warned that if the report's recommendations were ignored, there would be serious trouble in this country after the war. As the Christmas of 1942 approached, Britons pored over Beveridge's proposals as if they were scripture. They had endured rationing, bombings, separation, and sacrifice. Now they demanded that those sacrifices mean something. Faced with such overwhelming public support, the government shifted its stance. Initially cautious, it began to acknowledge that the report could not be ignored. Official statements reassured the public that social insurance reforms were under consideration, though ministers carefully avoided making firm commitments. Pressure, however, continued to mount. The war had forced a new collectivist spirit upon the nation. Rationing, evacuation, and conscription had reinforced the idea that society functioned best when burdens and benefits were shared. The question was no longer whether social reform was necessary, but how far it could go. Beveridge's blueprint had become more than a policy proposal. It had become a social contract. 3 years later, Britain faced a defining moment. The 1945 general election was not just a contest between political parties, it was a referendum on the kind of country Britain wanted to be. Would it return to pre-war conservatism or embrace Beveridge's vision? The result was emphatic. Churchill, the wartime hero, was ousted and Labour secured a landslide victory under Clement Attlee. The new government wasted little time. Beveridge's ideas, once considered ambitious, became the foundation of a post-war transformation. The National Health Service was born, offering universal healthcare free at the point of use. Comprehensive social security was introduced, ensuring support from cradle to grave. The welfare state, as it came to be known, was not implemented exactly as Beveridge had outlined. Some compromises were made, political battles fought, but its core principles endured. Resistance to these changes was fierce. The British Medical Association opposed the NHS, fearing government interference in medical practice. Insurance companies saw their role diminished. Private interests lobbied against state intervention. To overcome this, Aneurin Bevan, the architect of the NHS, struck a deal, famously agreeing to stuff their mouths with gold to secure doctors' cooperation. Despite these conflicts, the NHS became one of the most celebrated institutions in British history, a defining achievement of post-war Britain. While subsequent decades would see debates over funding, efficiency and privatisation, the principle that healthcare should be a right, not a privilege, remained unshaken. 75 years later, Beveridge's legacy still looms large. His vision shaped not only Britain but influenced welfare models worldwide. Yet his assumptions, particularly about full employment, did not anticipate the complexities of the modern economy. Automation, globalization, and the rise of precarious work challenged the traditional welfare model. The economic realities of the 21st century have strained the systems he helped build. Critics argue that the welfare state has been eroded by austerity and privatization, while supporters contend that it must evolve, not disappear. The challenges are different, but the fundamental question remains the same. How should a just society protect its citizens from insecurity? Beveridge's report was not merely a product of its time, it was a statement of enduring principles. His revolution was not waged with rifles or barricades, but in Parliament and policy papers. It did not come easily. Its realisation was fought over, delayed, compromised, and resisted. But in the end, it reshaped Britain. The welfare state was not a utopian dream, but a deliberate decision to build a different kind of country. The battle over its future continues, but Beveridge's central conviction remains: a society cannot call itself civilized if it allows its people to fall into destitution. The war that birthed his report is long over, but the struggle over its ideals endures. There is a weight to legacies like Beveridge's, a force that continues to shape policy debates, political identities and national priorities long after the original battles have faded. His report was conceived in war, but its greatest test was always going to be the peacetime Britain that followed. The institutions it inspired, the welfare state, the NHS, the principle of social security, were not static achievements, but evolving commitments, subject to the pressures of economic downturns, shifting ideologies and political recalibrations. What began as a radical intervention in the 1940s became, by the latter half of the 20th century, a defining feature of British society, so deeply ingrained that even its critics have struggled to dismantle it outright. Beveridge's assumption of full employment as the foundation of the welfare state was, in retrospect, an optimism rooted in his time. Post-war Britain saw a period of economic expansion, a world where industrial jobs were stable, union power was strong, and the idea of lifetime employment was not yet obsolete. The social insurance model depended on these conditions. People would contribute during their working lives and draw upon the system when needed. But the late 20th and early 21st centuries have not been so predictable. The economic certainties of Beveridge's Britain have eroded, replaced by automation, precarious labour, and a shifting global economy that has unsettled traditional employment structures. Gig work, zero-hour contracts, and the rise of platform-based employment have changed the landscape in ways that Beveridge could not have foreseen. The political tides have also fluctuated. The post-war consensus that embraced Beveridge's ideas began to fracture by the late 1970s. The welfare state, once seen as a necessary foundation for social stability, came under increasing scrutiny. Economic crises, shifting ideologies, and the growing influence of neoliberal thought reframed public discourse. The argument moved from how best to expand social protections to whether the state should provide them at all. Margaret Thatcher's government in the 1980s introduced market-driven reforms, emphasising personal responsibility over state intervention. The welfare state was not dismantled, but it was fundamentally reoriented. Public housing was sold off, private sector involvement in public services increased, and social security became more conditional, tied to behavioural requirements and means testing. Beveridge's vision had not been abandoned, but it had been reshaped by an era that viewed state intervention with suspicion. Despite these changes, the core principles of Beveridge's welfare state remained resilient. The NHS, despite recurrent funding crises and political disputes, remains one of Britain's most cherished institutions. The idea that no citizen should be left destitute remains a political baseline, even if the mechanisms to achieve that goal have been contested. Social security has shifted, but its necessity has not disappeared. The financial crisis of 2008 and the subsequent years of austerity policies reignited debates about the role of the state in protecting its citizens. The COVID-19 pandemic further underscored the importance of a robust public health system and economic safety nets. The global crisis exposed the vulnerabilities of deregulated labour markets and privatised healthcare systems, forcing governments to intervene in ways that echoed the principles Beveridge championed. Yet, the future of the welfare state remains uncertain. The pressures of an ageing population, the increasing costs of healthcare, and the rise of economic inequality pose challenges that Beveridge's original framework was not designed to address. The question is no longer whether the state should play a role in social security, but how that role should evolve. Should universal basic income replace traditional unemployment benefits? Should healthcare move toward a hybrid public-private model to sustain funding? Should taxation be restructured to reflect the new economic realities of wealth concentration and global corporate power? These debates continue, shaped by the same underlying concerns that drove Beveridge's report: how to balance economic sustainability with social justice, how to protect the vulnerable without discouraging enterprise, and how to ensure that national prosperity benefits the many rather than the few. Beveridge's legacy is not just in the institutions his report helped create, but in the questions it forced societies to confront. His work was not just about numbers and policies, it was about a fundamental moral argument that no person should be left to suffer when society has the means to prevent it. His revolution was not about overthrowing governments, but about redefining the social contract between the state and its citizens. That contract remains under negotiation. The battle over public spending, the tension between market efficiency and social protection, the ideological clashes over state intervention, these are not relics of the past, but ongoing struggles that define modern governance. The world that Beveridge sought to reshape no longer exists in the same form, but the dilemmas he addressed persist. The fight against want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness did not end with the establishment of the welfare state. It simply entered a new phase. Economic downturns, political shifts, and technological advancements continue to challenge the structures designed to combat these evils. The debate is no longer about whether the welfare state should exist, but about what it should become. History does not stand still, and neither do the ideas that shape it. Beveridge's vision was forged in a moment of crisis when the old order was crumbling and new possibilities were emerging. Today, as societies face economic uncertainties, rising inequality and political upheaval, his legacy serves as both a foundation and a challenge. The welfare state was never meant to be a static institution. It was a framework for progress, a system designed to adapt to the evolving needs of its people. The real test of Beveridge's revolution is not in its past achievements, but in whether future generations will have the courage to reimagine it for their own time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast, an audio essay read by me, Holly, your digital narrator. Until next time.